I remember the cold first. Not the betrayal, not the paperwork, not the moment everything cracked beneath my feet. Just the cold. It sat on my skin the way grief does, quiet, persistent, familiar. Alaska has a way of teaching you to endure before it teaches you to understand. My name is Mary Whitmore, and for most of my life, I believed I understood everything that mattered. I understood how to steady a patient's breathing in the emergency room, how to stitch a wound without trembling, how to read fear in someone's eyes before they spoke. Nursing sharpens you in ways you don't notice until much later. But I never learned how to read the person sleeping beside me. I was 62 when everything began to unravel, though the threads had been loosening long before that. For 40 years, Richard and I lived in the same cedar-sided house overlooking Kachemak Bay. 40 years of winters that cracked the windowsill paint, springs that smelled of thawing earth, summers lit by sunsets that refused to end, and autumns that came dressed in quiet gold. We met young, too young to know who we were, but old enough to believe in forever. Richard had this easy confidence, the kind that makes you feel steadier just by walking beside him. He could build anything with his hands, docks, boats, wooden frames that turned into homes for families who trusted him. I used to love the way he smelled of cedar and sea salt when he came through the door. I believed that smell meant safety. I believed his hands would never take something from me. But the truth doesn't care about what you believe. It moves how it wants, when it wants, and it waits for the moment you can finally see it. The beginning of the end didn't look dramatic. It looked ordinary. A misplaced receipt, a late evening that didn't sound quite right, a softness in his voice that didn't belong to me anymore. But I brushed each sign aside. Long marriages teach you to choose peace over curiosity. I didn't want to be suspicious. Suspicion is a cold companion. And yet, one morning, the suspicion followed me into the bank. The teller smiled at me the way she always did, kindly, predictably, the same woman who used to bring cookies to the clinic on holidays. She slid a form across the counter. "Just your signature, Mary," she said. Her voice was warm. My hands were steady. And then I saw it. My signature. At least someone wanted it to look like mine. The curve was careful, too careful, neater than I had ever been, precise in a way I'd never signed anything in my life. Did I withdraw this? I asked, even though the answer was already thick in my throat. $5,000. Gone. She hesitated. "Do you want a freeze on the account? We can print the statement for you." My pulse didn't race. My tongue didn't dry. Panic doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. So I nodded. And when she handed me the stack of printouts, it felt heavier than paper should ever feel. I walked out into the raw wind, the bay stretching gray and indifferent before me. I sat in my car, and I read. Withdrawals I didn't make. Purchases I never saw. Charges at stores I never stepped foot in. Hotel rooms in Anchorage. And then a name, written in the tiniest corner of a line item. Elaine. I'd heard that name before. She was the new assistant at the company, the one who helped with invoices, the one who stayed late to finish paperwork, the one who somehow came up in his stories more often than our own daughter. I pressed my fingers to my lips and breathed into the fleece collar of my coat. I didn't cry. Crying would have broken something inside me I wasn't ready to release. Instead, I let the truth sit beside me in the cold car, like an uninvited passenger. And I thought, not of anger, not of betrayal, but of survival. Nurses don't crumble when the numbers on a monitor dip into danger. We act, we observe, we gather facts, we stay steady. So I gathered. I asked the teller for more printouts. I memorized dates. I circled charges. I whispered each amount under my breath like a diagnosis building inside my mind. By the time I drove home, the light had softened into that eerie Alaskan twilight where day and night share the sky. Richard was already there, humming in the kitchen, stirring stew, like he hadn't stolen a thing from me. He kissed my forehead. I swallowed the metallic taste of truth. For the first time in decades, I watched my husband from a distance of only a few feet. And I realized, I didn't know this man. Not anymore. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't even speak. Instead, I went upstairs, opened my bedside drawer, and took out a small blue notebook I hadn't used in years. I wrote one sentence on the first page. Begin here. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the cold, beneath the disbelief, beneath the grief I hadn't yet allowed myself to feel, a quiet fire lit. A fire that would not go out. A fire that would carry me through the months ahead, through the lies, the discovery, the legal battle, the impossible truths, and all the way to the moment I finally took back everything that was mine. I didn't sleep that night. The house felt unfamiliar, as if I had been dropped into someone else's life without warning. The heater hummed its usual winter song, and the pipes clicked in that tired rhythm I'd grown used to over decades. But something in the air had changed. A heaviness, a question, a quiet betrayal settling into corners like unwelcome fog. Richard breathed beside me, slow and steady. Once, that sound was comfort. Once, that rhythm meant partnership, shared burdens, and a kind of safety I didn't question. But that night, each inhale felt practiced, and each exhale seemed like something he'd stolen without asking. I watched the shadows on the ceiling shift as the hours dragged on, tracing the faint cracks in the paint. Had they always been there? Or had I simply been too blind or too trusting to notice? Morning arrived without color. In Alaska, some mornings feel less like beginnings and more like quiet consequences of the night before. I rose before him, wrapped my robe tighter, and walked downstairs. The cold wooden floor stung beneath my feet. I made coffee with automatic movements, as if my hands still remembered who I had been yesterday, though I no longer did. The bank statements lay where I had left them. Paper shouldn't feel heavy, but they did. Every line, every date, every quiet theft listed in ink that had never passed through my hands. $5,000, boutique purchases, a hotel in Anchorage, a restaurant receipt with 2 entrees, a gift shop I had never stepped inside, a name. Elaine. I whispered it into the rim of my coffee mug, and the sound felt foreign in my own house. I didn't cry. Crying has a way of making truth feel final, and I wasn't ready for finality, not yet. Instead, I laid each statement flat, smoothing their edges, the way I would smooth a patient's blankets before asking where it hurt. Evidence needs care. It tells its stories slowly, one careful detail at a time. When Richard came downstairs, he kissed my forehead, warm and familiar, as if the world had never shifted under my feet. If guilt lived anywhere on him, it hid deep behind the eyes I once adored. He moved around the kitchen with ease, humming a tune I didn't recognize, stirring his coffee with the same 3 slow circles he'd done every morning for 40 years. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. "You're up early," he said lightly. "I had things on my mind," I answered, my voice steady, my gaze unreadable. "Anything I can help with?" he asked. I watched his back, the way his shoulders rose and fell in a rhythm I once trusted. I realized then that he believed nothing had shifted. He believed I hadn't seen the truth. He believed I was still the woman who never questioned him. "No," I said quietly, "I've got it." And I did, just not in the way he expected. For the next few days, I lived inside a quiet fog between knowing and pretending not to know. Pretending allowed me space to observe. Knowing kept my heart anchored in something fierce and still unnamed. I noticed details I'd ignored. The longer showers, the faint trace of a new cologne. His phone now guarded like treasure, always face down, always locked, always within reach. He hummed more often, not the content humming of a man at peace, but the distracted, nervous humming of someone whose mind lived somewhere else. He left the house with rushed excuses: late meeting, emergency at the site, client issue. Excuses piled so neatly they were almost insulting. And I kept smiling. I kept stirring dinner. I kept folding laundry. I kept going to my shifts at the clinic. I played the role of the woman he believed I was: predictable, soft-spoken, oblivious. He underestimated me, and that was his first mistake. One evening, he stepped outside to take a call. He rarely bothered with privacy before. I stood by the sink, hands wet from dishes, and the cold air carried his voice through the window, just enough for the words to wound. "I miss you too," he murmured. "No, she doesn't suspect a thing. I told you. Soon." Soon. The words sliced me open quietly, elegantly, without the courtesy of warning. I gripped the edge of the counter and felt my heartbeat rise into my throat, not with fear, but with clarity. When he came back inside, he smiled at me the same way he always had, kissed my forehead with practiced affection, and said, "Just business." "Of course," I replied, matching his tone perfectly. He believed me, and that was his second mistake. A few days later, during my lunch break at the clinic, I called our lawyer. I didn't spill my pain onto the phone line. I didn't scream or sob. Instead, I asked in a calm, almost clinical voice what I needed to do to access our full financial records. He paused, hearing something in my tone he didn't name. "Mary, is everything all right?" I didn't lie. I simply didn't answer. "Come in," he said. "Bring whatever you have." The next morning, the fog hung low over the bay, a soft gray curtain stretching across the world I thought I knew. I drove with my notebook in my coat pocket and the bank statements folded in my bag. When I stepped into his office, the warmth fogged my glasses. He motioned for me to sit, and I placed the papers on his desk with hands steadier than I expected. He examined them the way a surgeon examines an X-ray, slowly, methodically, searching for fractures beneath the surface. When he finally looked up, his eyes were heavy with confirmation. "This isn't good," he said. I nodded once, a quiet, controlled acceptance. "It gets worse," I whispered. I told him everything about the forged signature, the Anchorage hotel, the receipts, the name Elaine said with a softness that now felt cruel. He listened without interrupting, without judgment, without surprise. When I finished, he folded his hands. "Do you want a divorce?" "No," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "Not yet." He nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. "Then we're going to document everything." He opened a folder and slid it toward me. The folder was empty, but the space inside it felt like a beginning. "You'll keep copies of every statement, every receipt, every message, dates, times, patterns. You'll bring them all to me, quietly." Quietly. I repeated the word in my mind until it felt like armor. "I'm sorry, Mary," he said. "So am I." I stepped out into the icy air, the wind biting my cheeks, but I felt more awake than I had in years. Something inside me, something long buried, rose with the cold. My life wasn't falling apart. It was opening. and I was finally ready to walk through it. I didn't confront Richard, not then, not when the lies were fresh and the evidence still warm from my hands. People imagine betrayal as a spark that ignites confrontation, but the truth is quieter than that. It settles, it simmers, it waits. It becomes a slow, deliberate awakening that reshapes the way you breathe. I returned home from the lawyer's office with my coat still carrying the smell of winter and my thoughts sharper than the cold. Richard stood at the sink washing dishes, humming the same unfamiliar tune he'd hummed for weeks. For a moment, I watched him. Not the man I'd married at 21, not the father of our daughter, but the man he had become when he believed I wasn't looking. His shoulders relaxed, his voice soft, his rhythm steady. Guilt does not always make people tense. Sometimes it makes them careless. He glanced over his shoulder. "Long day at the clinic?" I nodded. "Long enough." He smiled. "I heated up dinner for you. Thought you'd be tired." His kindness had edges now, sharp ones, shaped by secrecy. A man who truly cares speaks with openness. A man who hides speaks with generosity. I felt the difference sharply. I thanked him and sat at the table, pretending to unwind, pretending to be the woman he thought he was fooling. He talked about work, about a new contractor, about needing to stay late this week. When he said the last part, he kept his eyes on the dishes, not on me. I didn't challenge him. I simply noted the date, the time, the phrasing. Part of reclaiming your life is learning the choreography of deceit, not to mimic it, but to recognize the steps. When he finally kissed my cheek and left the house that night with too much cologne and too much certainty, I stood by the door long after it clicked shut. The house hummed around me, refrigerator, heater, the faint drip in the upstairs bathroom I'd been meaning to fix. For the first time, the sounds felt foreign, like belonging to a life that had already slipped out from under me. I walked into the kitchen, pulled out my notebook, and wrote down every inconsistency I could remember. The anchorage charge, the boutique purchases, the late nights, the phone calls outside, the forged signature that looked like mine if someone had studied it without understanding my hand. Each detail felt like a stitch tightening the shape of a truth I could no longer unsee. Over the next week, my days split into two lives. At the clinic, I was Nurse Mary, steady, capable, comforting. I changed bandages, listened to stories, held hands through fear. People trusted me in ways Richard never could have understood. My patients never lied to me about their wounds. At home, I was something else, a quiet observer in a house full of clues. I checked pockets when I did laundry. I looked at the mileage on his truck. I noticed receipts left in the trash, faint lipstick smudges on napkins, a stray hair on his coat that didn't belong to either of us. Betrayal leaves crumbs, even when the betrayer believes he's swept clean behind him. What broke me wasn't the physical evidence. One night, he returned home later than usual, smelling of perfume as faint as a question. He kissed my forehead, but his mind was elsewhere, already gone to a place where I didn't exist. As he walked upstairs, I watched him with a calm so deep it almost frightened me. I realized then that I no longer feared losing him. I feared losing myself. That fear sharpened my resolve. The next morning, instead of going straight to the clinic, I drove to my lawyer's office. He welcomed me with a quiet nod, the kind reserved for people who carry truths too heavy for small talk. We reviewed everything, paper by paper, line by line. He asked questions, and I answered without hesitation. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "We have enough to proceed," he said softly. I exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of confirmation. I had known the truth long before I gathered the evidence. The papers only sharpened what I already felt in my bones. "What happens next?" I asked. Next, he said, we begin quietly. Bank reviews, account freezes, requests for documentation. He won't know everything at once. It will unfold gradually. I nodded. Good. He hesitated for a moment, then added, you understand, Mary, this process will change everything. I met his eyes steadily. Everything has already changed. Driving home, I felt a stillness settle over me, not like resignation, but like clarity. Clarity can be cold, but it is clean. It cuts away delusion the way winter strips leaves from branches, leaving only the truth of the tree behind. When I stepped into the house, Richard was sitting at the table drinking coffee, flipping through the paper as if he still lived in the version of our life where I believed him. He looked up. You're home later than usual. I hung my coat on the hook, leveled my breath, and said with quiet precision, I had things to take care of. He smiled, unaware. Busy day? Very. He folded the paper and stood. Mary, is everything okay? I met his gaze with a calmness he couldn't recognize. Yes, I said, softly, for the first time in a long while. He smiled, relieved by an answer he didn't understand. But I understood. I understood everything. Winter settled over Alaska like a heavy quilt, dimming the daylight and stretching the nights into long, reflective corridors of silence. In those hours, when the house creaked and sighed with the cold, I would lie awake, listening to the rhythm of the world outside, wind scraping against the siding, the distant groan of shifting ice, the soft hum of the heater fighting to keep the dark at bay. I had lived through decades of winters, but this one felt different. This one felt like a bridge between who I had been and who I would have to become. Richard moved through the house with an ease that was almost astonishing. He had no idea that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift, no idea how precarious his footing had become. He stepped lightly, carelessly, humming, making coffee, discussing small-town gossip, as if the structure of our marriage wasn't already cracking in clean, quiet lines. That obliviousness revealed more about him than any receipt or message ever could. A man who believes he is safe rarely looks down. I watched him with a softness I didn't fully understand at first. It wasn't love, it wasn't longing. It was the kind of detached compassion a nurse feels when she knows a patient is sicker than he realizes, when she holds information that will soon change everything he believes about his own body. I knew something Richard didn't know. The diagnosis had already been made. The treatment was already underway. He sat beside me at the kitchen table one morning, sipping coffee with that familiar little exhale he always made after the first sip. It used to comfort me, that sound. I know that seems small, but marriage is built on small sounds. Now it only reminded me of how fragile illusions can be. He asked what my plans were for the day. I told him I needed to run errands, and I did, just not the kind he imagined. The lawyer and I worked quietly. Banks were notified, accounts were flagged, old deeds were reviewed. A request was filed to examine corporate transfers. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just steady, concentrated pressure. Paper has its own kind of gravity. Once enough of it accumulates, it becomes impossible to ignore. At the clinic, I found solace in routine. Human suffering, oddly enough, grounds you. It reminds you that your own pain is not singular, not terminal, not without remedy. I stitched a fisherman's palm after he slipped on the ice near the docks. I checked on a young mother's feverish baby. I helped an elderly woman understand her new medication. Each interaction reminded me that my hands still knew how to heal, even if my heart was still learning how to mend itself. Sometimes during lunch breaks, I would drive out to the water. The bay in winter is a stern teacher. It shows you how to endure quietly. I'd sit in the parked car with the heater ticking, watching the gulls circle and the tide breathe in and out like something ancient and indifferent. I understood that indifference better now. It wasn't cruelty. It was simply nature's way of showing us that everything moves on, with or without our consent. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. I had stopped by the company office under the guise of dropping off a form. Elaine was there, typing at her desk, hair pulled back neatly, a mug of coffee beside her. She looked younger up close, younger than someone carrying this much weight should look. When she saw me, her eyes widened, surprised, nervous, perhaps even guilty. I didn't move toward her. I didn't confront her. I simply nodded politely. "Did you need something, Mary?" she asked, her voice pinned between professionalism and unease. "I'm just leaving this with the crew schedule," I said. "Richard asked me to drop it by." Her shoulders lowered a fraction. Relief? Fear? I couldn't tell. I didn't care enough to dissect it. As I turned to leave, something in her expression caught me, a flicker of something that wasn't malice. It was shame. Deep, quiet shame, the kind that lingers long after the thrill of wrongdoing fades. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something unexpected, pity. Not for what she had done, but for what she had tied herself to. A man who betrays once betrays easily. That is a truth as old as the tide. I walked out of the office with steady steps. I wasn't shaken. If anything, the encounter clarified something inside me. This wasn't a love triangle. It wasn't a petty affair. It wasn't about youth or beauty or desire. It was about choices. His choices. Choices he made with my money, my trust, my name. There is a kind of quiet fury that doesn't roar or tremble. It sharpens. It focuses. It becomes a tool you carry in your pocket like a scalpel. Small, precise, devastating when used properly. A few days later, I found Richard sitting at the table with bills spread around him, rubbing his temples dramatically, the way he always had when he wanted sympathy. He looked up and offered a tired smile, as if we still shared burdens. "Something's off with the accounts," he said, shaking his head. "Bank must be making mistakes." My pulse didn't even skip. "Is that right?" I asked softly. "Yeah," he said, "I'll straighten it out." He had no idea that it was already being straightened out, but not in the direction he imagined. That night, as he slept, I stood at the foot of the bed watching him. Snow blew against the window, dulling the world to a soft white hush. I wondered how long it would take him to realize that the life he thought he controlled was already slipping out of his hands. I wondered whether he'd panic or deny, whether he'd blame me or blame fate. Betrayers rarely blame themselves. The next morning, the air felt different, thinner somehow, as if the house knew what was coming. I grabbed my notebook, my scarf, and my keys. Before leaving, I paused at the door and looked back at the life I was quietly unthreading. Not with sadness, not with nostalgia, just acknowledgement. Some endings aren't explosive. Some endings happen the same way winter arrives, softly, steadily, inevitability disguised as snow. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, he greeted me with a sheet of paper in his hand, something new, something important. The review had begun. Motions were moving. Freezes were in place. A judge had ordered additional documentation. Steps had been set in motion that could not be undone, not by charm or excuses or humming in the kitchen. He looked at me with a seriousness that matched the weight of the moment. "It's happening, Mary," he said. I pulled in a steady breath. "Good," I replied. Because winter is not the end. Winter is preparation. And I was preparing for the life that would come after the thaw. The day the hearing date arrived, the snow outside had softened into that pale, muted light Alaska wears just before spring. I woke before dawn, long before the alarm, feeling something I hadn't felt in many months, stillness. Not the quiet of resignation, but the steady breath of someone who has finally reached the edge of a long-shadowed path and can see, even faintly, the outline of a clearing ahead. I dressed slowly, choosing the same navy blue sweater I used to wear for difficult shifts at the hospital. It was a small superstition, I suppose. That sweater had carried me through nights when patients hovered between life and loss, and I needed to be the one fixed point in the room. Today, I needed that steadiness for myself. The courthouse sat on a low hill overlooking the bay. The wind was sharp, but the sky held the delicate gray that comes before new weather. I walked inside with my lawyer beside me, each of us carrying files, mine held together with paper clips, his organized into thick folders. Paper rustled in the hallway as others moved through the building, but the world felt strangely hushed, as if watching. Richard arrived a few minutes later. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in the way a man looks when he suddenly finds the ground beneath him rearranged and doesn't yet understand how it happened. He glanced at me, searching my face for the version of me he once knew, the one who soothed, who trusted, who forgave without question. That woman loved him for 40 years, and maybe she always would in some deep, quiet place. But she no longer lived at the surface. She no longer took the blame for storms she didn't cause. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the clerk called our case, and whatever words he was reaching for dissolved into the air between us. Inside the courtroom, time seemed to stretch itself thin. My lawyer spoke calmly, laying out each piece of evidence like a surgeon arranging instruments. The withdrawals forged in my name, the hotel charges, the transfer of business shares done without proper authorization, the deed with the reversion clause, the pattern of funds misapplied under the guise of corporate expenses. Nothing dramatic, nothing cruel, just facts. Facts have a way of speaking even when voices shake. Richard's attorney tried to frame things as misunderstandings, clerical errors, moments of marital miscommunication. But misunderstandings don't forge signatures. Clerical errors don't book hotel rooms hundreds of miles away. Miscommunication doesn't transfer property behind closed doors. The judge listened, eyes steady, fingers folded. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of both clarity and inevitability. She issued a ruling that seemed to settle into the room like snow landing on quiet earth. The business transfers would be reviewed and corrected. All accounts associated with marital funds were to be secured under joint oversight. Any sale, investment, or distribution of company assets would require my explicit written consent, and a formal investigation into unauthorized use of my signature would proceed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Justice delivered in calm tones carries its own thunder. Richard looked at me then, not with anger, not with apology, but with the startled recognition of a man who has just realized that the person he underestimated remembered everything, every detail, every step, every lie softened with charm, and every truth bent under the weight of secrecy. I didn't look away. After the hearing, I walked down the courthouse steps into the cold air, breathing in the kind of cold that wakes the bones and clears the mind. My lawyer shook my hand, offering a quiet nod before heading to his car. I stood there a moment longer, watching my breath unravel into the winter air, feeling something unravel inside me as well. Something tight, something clenched, something that had been holding me upright through sheer force. And then I felt it loosen. Not forgiveness, not yet, but release. The next weeks unfolded not with spectacle, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of rebuilding. The auditor confirmed the irregularities, accounts were corrected, transactions were reversed. The partial ownership granted to Elaine dissolved under the scrutiny of improper authorization. The bank rerouted remaining funds into a secured account under my name. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't destruction, it was restoration, the quiet kind that doesn't demand applause. One morning, a moving truck rumbled up the road to the cottage I had chosen months earlier in the privacy of my own planning. I watched as the driver carried my few boxes inside: books, sweaters, the small blue thermos I loved, a framed photograph of a younger me standing on the docks with my hair whipping in the wind. I didn't bring much. I didn't need much. I had chosen this place for its view of the ocean and the way the sun rose over the fir trees like a promise whispered onto the water. That first night, I sat on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket, listening to the tide pull and release along the rocks below. The moon was high, brushing silver across the surface of the bay. I thought of all the versions of myself I had lived through: young wife, tired nurse, trusting partner, betrayed woman, steady strategist, quiet warrior. And now, simply Mary, a woman with a future she rebuilt piece by piece. I started volunteering at the clinic again, just once a week. Old patients recognized me, their eyes lighting with the kind of familiarity that warms even the coldest days. One of them, a widower who came in for blood pressure checks, brought me a jar of homemade jam and said, "Good to see you still steady, Mary." I smiled at that. Steady, yes, that was something I had learned to be. Sometimes, on my days off, I would drive to the small town 2 bays over. There was a bakery there that made pastries with a dusting of sugar so light it felt like snowfall on the tongue. I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching people come and go, strangers living lives untouched by mine. There was comfort in that, too, in knowing the world didn't revolve around my pain, that life moved on, endlessly weaving itself with or without our permission. One afternoon, I walked along the shoreline near my cottage, letting the icy wind push against my coat. A gull perched on a piece of driftwood turned its head toward me, curious but unimpressed, as if to say, "You made it. Good. Now keep walking." And I did. The ocean stretched wide in front of me, vast and disinterested. But that vastness didn't frighten me anymore. It felt like freedom, like space, like a life big enough to hold new stories. Every now and then, someone from town would ask gently how I was doing, whether things had settled. I always answered honestly. Things had shifted, yes, but they had shifted in the direction of truth. And truth, even when it hurts, is a safer home than illusion. Some nights, when the world grows quiet and the cottage seems suspended between the dark sea and the darker sky, I sit with a cup of tea and let memory drift in. I don't fight it. Memory isn't an enemy. It's a witness. It reminds me of what I survived, of who I became, of what I reclaimed. I don't know whether Richard ever understood the full weight of what he lost. Not the money, not the house, not the company privileges, but me. He lost the woman who trusted him, who built a life beside him, who would have carried him through any storm if only he hadn't been the one to open the door and invite the cold in. And Elaine? I heard she moved away quietly, without commotion, without a goodbye. I don't wish her harm. I hope she finds a life that doesn't require borrowing someone else's. As for me, I have the ocean, the clinic, the cottage wrapped in its shawl of pine trees. I have mornings where the light slips across my floor like a silk ribbon, and evenings where the wind sings through the eaves. I have my own name, my own peace, my own steady breath. And if you are listening to this, if you have ever doubted your instincts, if you have felt something slipping away quietly in your own life, if you have stood in the cold wondering whether you're strong enough to step forward, hear me when I say this. You are. You can gather the papers. You can steady your hands. You can reclaim what was taken. You can build a life that fits you again. The world may not applaud you, but the ocean will whisper your name in the tide, and the dawn will greet you like someone who remembered you all along. My name is Mary. This is my story, and I took back everything. If this touched you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or if you want to hear more true stories of courage, resilience, and quiet justice, you are welcome here. Share your thoughts below and join us by subscribing. There are many more stories waiting for you.